Dr. Hess, as you know, we are producing a history archive for the Society, and interviews with pioneers like yourself and leaders of the Society will be an important part of the archive. You did undergraduate work at St. Francis College in Pennsylvania, followed by medical school and residency in internal medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. What influenced your decision to go into medicine?
That's a tough one. It was a long time ago. I think I initially only wanted to become a general practitioner. And it's the only thing I knew. And go back, I came from the mountains in Pennsylvania, a very small town. Doctor lived down the street. It was kind of a good influence. Helped me in growing up. But when I arrived at the University of Pittsburgh, first I became very interested in a physiology course they had there, which was modeled off of the Harvard program. No textbook, you had to do it all in the library. And I met a muscle physiologist who at that time was making the transition from skeletal muscle physiology to cardiac muscle physiology. And this was the era of Ed Sonnenblick and the young Gene Brunwald, and it was a very exciting era. So I got very interested and spent my last 3 years in medical school going to medical school and working in the lab. The thing that very much influenced me is I decided to spend most of my senior year in medical school at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, where I was planning on doing exclusively clinical cardiology. And I got called into the consultant's office, who was John Hamer. And John's laying there open with a copy of Circ Research there. And it was it's kind of a pivotal study in the field of the failure of intracellular excitation, contraction, coupling in acute heart failure models. And he points at the list of authors and he said, "Is that you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Why don't you set up something here at St. Bart's to do it?" I said, "It can't be done." I said, "First thing I need is a scintillation counter." I figured that would throw him. Big piece of equipment, count radioactivity. He said, "Come with me." He walked down into the hall, down the hall, opened the door, and there was the exact same model I'd worked with in Pittsburgh. So from scratch, I set up a project with a chap named Elliot Scheinborn, who got his MD off that project. And we published a paper in Nature, and then the whole thing just rolled. So I was off and running in the world of cardiovascular medicine.
So cardiology was your interest?
Correct.
So how did you get into heart failure?
Actually, I got drafted in '73 and did clinical cardiology in the Navy, helped take care of our POWs that came home from Vietnam, and went back with a combined appointment in physiology and cardiology. And for a non-technically trained cardiologist at that time who had a firm background in physiology, heart failure just seemed like the perfect thing to do because it all altered physiology. And so I found myself reading and studying everything I get a hold of on heart failure at the time. And everyone thought I was kind of crazy.
Because it was not such a popular area.
It was not a popular area at all. I mean, at that time, that would be in the late '70s. For all practical purposes, the world of cardiology existed around a cardiac catheterization laboratory in coronary artery disease, because there's where the big advances were being made. You know, in the late '60s, the discovery of coronary angiography, and then the saphenous vein bypass grafting, and so everything was centered around a cath lab, and I wasn't.
So in 1967, when you heard about the first human heart transplant, you were a medical student at the time?
I was a medical student at the time. I thought it was very intriguing, never paid a bit of attention to it.
Right.
Never paid a bit of attention to it.
So you would say it didn't have an impact on your decision-making to go into cardiology later on in heart failure? I
think what made my decision about transplant was in '79, it was '79, I decided to go full-time into the Division of Cardiology and Medicine and was looking for something a little more than heart failure. And I started reading about Dick Lauer's heart transplant program there. And I actually met him in the stairwell of our old hospital. And I introduced myself to him. And I remember precisely telling him that, Dr. Lauer, there's really nothing about your heart transplant patients that a very good internist who knows a little bit of cardiology couldn't take care of. And he looked me square in the eye and said, Mike, there are 2 patients coming into our clinical research unit post-transplant Monday morning. Go to work.
And from there on, this became a very long relationship.
A very long relationship.
So at that time, how do you think was the response of your colleagues, your cardiology colleagues, towards the issue of heart transplantation at the time?
I think they thought it was a gimmick. I really do. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something they didn't really want anything to do with because it had none of their technology associated with it. We hadn't been studying coronary anatomy in the heart transplant patient yet. And they just kind of left me alone to do my thing.
So you must have felt quite lonely in your field amongst the group of cardiologists.
Not really, because what I found was a different world. I found a world of surgeons. Now, blessed or serendipity or what you want, the Medical College of Virginia surgically had a phenomenal impetus with a chap named David Hume, who was one of the pioneers in renal transplantation. He became chairman of surgery, and Richard Lauer was recruited from Shumway's group to come to Virginia to begin a heart transplant program. Dr. Hume died in an airplane crash, and one of his former residents named H.M. Lee, who was originally Korean, assumed his position as director of renal surgery or renal transplantation and vascular surgery, and was obviously a phenomenal intellect in the field to boot. And it didn't take me long to figure out that at that stage, all the rules of cardiac transplantation were based on what the renal transplanters had learned. And I distinctly remember multiple times going to Dick Lauer and asking questions. He'd say, call HM up. Mm-hmm. So after a while, I went straight to HM, and that started a lifelong relationship with him.
Let's go back to 1980. In November 1980 in Miami, where a group of cardiac surgeons and cardiologists with an interest in heart transplantation met at the AHA meeting. Heart transplantation at the time was still, as you pointed out, seeing rather bleak outcomes after the initial wave of enthusiasm in the late 1960s and early 70s. What sort of discussions took place at that point amongst you guys?
It was, let's take it just a step back from November to, say, September or August. It all started with an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. Well, even one step beyond that. It became abundantly clear to me that there was nobody to talk to. I had H.M. Lee and his kidney transplant colleagues, a handful of us in cardiac transplant, one other part-time cardiologist in the cardiac surgical fellows, and Dick Lauer. But it was like you were in a vacuum. And all these questions were just bubbling up. And an editorial appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine by a chap named Alexander Leaf, who Jim Kirkland reminded me yesterday was a distinguished professor and the voice of American medicine or something, that made the flat-out statement that very little could be learned by transplanting the human heart. I said, this guy is off the wall. But I didn't know who to talk to. Well, I had heard by the rumor mill that one of my old roommates in medical school was helping Henry Bonson with their beginning of their heart transplant program, and I called him up. And I said, Mark, this was Mark Thompson at the University of Pittsburgh, and I said, Mark, why don't we form some sort of study group or something just to sit down and talk? And he said he thought it was a good idea, who else are you going to call? And I had met John Schroeder. And I called John up, and he thought it was a very bad idea. But wished me well and told me to call a guy in Minnesota named Mike Kay. And I called Mike up, introduced myself, and Mike was very enthusiastic. So I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'll con a meeting room out of the American Heart Association at their meeting in the evening, book it and get back to you. And I did that, and I told Mike and Mark, and John Schroeder promised to show up. He said he'd bring his colleagues from Stanford to the meeting that were in Miami then. And I said, just spread the word. The other thing that was very interesting, there was a chap named Albert Garate from Montreal. And Garate was spending 2 years in the research. He was a cardiac surgeon. He is a cardiac surgeon. 2 years in the research laboratory of Richard Lauer. And Albert reminds me that I walked out of the meeting room and he was just kind of walking by. And I said, Albert, we need to make this international. Come into this meeting. So from the very beginning, with our Canadian representative, we had an international group.
So you were really the key person who started the idea.
Yeah. At the Miami meeting, then, several people showed up that had phenomenal influences on the society in the coming years. Well, I met Jacques Loeschman, who was then in New Jersey. Guy walks up to me and goes, my name's Copeland from Arizona. And that's been a 30-year friendship, you know.
So, but it wasn't, just listening to you, it wasn't obviously the surgeons who started this idea. It was the cardiologist,
yes,
rather.
It was a cardiologist. Which
is quite interesting, because after that, they had basically the surgeons were more dominant in the early era of our society.
I think the surgeons were more dominant because cardiac transplant programs by nature tend to be at that time, tended to be very much surgically dominated.
So tell us a bit more about this early meeting. You obviously became the first president of our society. So how did people interact at the time, the surgeons? Well, what sort of studies have been presented? What were the data like? What was the discussion within the meeting like?
The next step in the formation of the society, that was in November in Miami, was we were invited to Michael Reese in Chicago, I think it was Michael Reese, by Jacques Loeschman. And we had a business meeting on a Saturday morning. And the representation started to grow. The Mayo was there, Minnesota was there, Pittsburgh, Stu Jamison came in from Stanford, Copeland, Pittsburgh. And we agreed to form a society and picked a name. And I said, what we can do is have a satellite meeting to the American College of Cardiology meeting. At this time, we'll present an exchange of information and data and organize the society formally. So we met, I guess it was on a Saturday in San Francisco. And now the word had spread significantly, and it's once again, it was the surgeons that pushed it. Terrence English sent a representative. Christian Cabral was there, all right? All the Stanford people were there, obviously. Arizona, the Mayo, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, Virginia. I think we had a total audience of 85 or something like that.
And what did you discuss?
Okay, what we decided on was to present the highlights of each program and what they're emphasizing. Margaret, and in addition, invited Margaret Billingham to update us all on endomyocardial biopsy interpretation. Actually, yesterday, Christian Cabral brought with him to our meeting last evening, volume 1, number 1 of the Journal of Heart Transplantation, which had all those studies in that were presented there. Stanford presented their strict surgical experience. Copeland presented his. It was more of, here's how we build our transplant program. I presented non-invasive radionucleotide data on the transplanted heart. And I was feeling pretty good about myself, and I walked back. They were all on chairs, and Ed Stinson was sitting on the edge, and he stuck his big cowboy boot out, and he almost tripped me. I goes, "What's up with you?" And he looks at me and goes, in his sly sense of humor, "If you guys in Virginia would get something to talk about, we might listen."
So it was the first real exchange of data.
It was the first real exchange of data, which we then got everyone to write.
Yes.
And was then duly published the following year.
And how in those days was the relationship between the North American physicians and the Europeans?
I think from the very beginning, it was a beautiful relationship. We had the Montreal group from Canada. Mr. English had sent Corey Pierce as a representative, and he was a big burly guy with a big bushy beard and just jovial as all get out. And the infectious personality of Christian Cabral. I mean, the man always had a smile on his face. He encouraged us, promised the utmost of cooperation. I think I saw it admirably a year or two later. I was in London for a basic research meeting, and Scheinborn had called me up and asked me to give a presentation at St. Bart's, and I just thought it would be the Division of Cardiology. And I walked into a packed room, and Christian Cabral walked up, and Terrence English walked up, and Corey Pierce walked up, and I was just overwhelmed.
I mean, you basically set the standard for our modern society today with respect to this multidisciplinary approach.
We were multidisciplinary from the very beginning.
I mean, you had pathologists, you had cardiologists, surgeons, you had pathologists, so basic researchers. So basically, this is, has been the philosophy for our society ever since.
By covering the spectrum of the discipline.
So how did you come up with this idea? How did it appeal to you?
I'm not quite sure. I think I was sitting there saying, I've got to find someone to talk to. I had enough of a scientific background at that time to realize you could not function in a vacuum. And the literature obviously was sparse. And I said, what we got to do is get the handful of people that kind of know what they're doing together and talk some of these problems out.
The other question which comes to my mind is, why were the South Africans not involved? Why was Christian Barnard not involved initially?
Two reasons. One, I had no idea under God's good earth how to attract them. But probably more than anything, if you wanted to make Richard Lauer angry, the only word you had to say was Christian Barnard. And Dick would go ballistic. There was something that happened between them. Maybe it was because Dr. Barnard had spent 7 months in Richmond. Dick had told us that he was supposed to be doing experimental mitral valve surgery. One of his books said he was doing renal transplant surgery. Then he went to Shumway's group for 3 months, and then went back to South Africa and did the first human case. I think both Dr. Lauer and Dr. Shumway thought that Barnard was blowing dust over their head, fed them wrong information, just learned, stole their information, and went back to South Africa and did it. I don't know about how Dr. Shumway felt about him, but Dr. Lauer had no love for Christian Barnard, was very clear about it.
So it was a no-go to involve the physicians.
Well, we had an attachment.
Right.
Because Losman, who was then in New Jersey,
he was originally South African.
Was originally South African and had trained there.
True, yes.
So we gave Jacques the job of bringing the South Africans in the following year or so. And I think it was a German surgeon who had gone to South Africa that took Barnard's place.
Bruno Reichert.
Yes, Bruno Reichert.
Yeah.
And by meeting 2 or 3, he was an integral part of the society. So it didn't take long to bring the South Africans in.
When you became the first president, obviously you also had to deal with governmental agencies concerning the issue of transplantation. To take that forward in particular, can you comment on this?
Yeah, that was one of the major, we set out several goals at that first meeting. And one of the major goals for the Americans was Medicare approval for cardiac transplantation. Because it's no different today than it was back then, that when Medicare dictates rules, all the other insurance companies follow. And at that time, Medicare had not approved cardiac transplantation. And it was one of the goals of the American section of the society is to educate the Medicare personnel to cover financially the cardiac transplant procedure. What they did is in turn around and fund a study out of a group called the Battelle Corporation in Seattle, Washington, with a little guy named Roger Evans, who I met again last night, who came up, and he only had a handful of institutions he based this on. I think it was obviously Stanford, Minnesota, the Mayo, Pittsburgh, MCV, and he pulled all their data into 5 volumes. I swear he had every op report in the whole thing of all those patients. And it was entitled a National Transplantation Study of '85 or something. And that then formed a series of hearings. I remember one set of hearings, Jack Copeland represented the surgeons in this country, and I represented the cardiologists, and we testified. And that resulted in the National Transplantation Act of 1986 and Medicare coverage, where it was 84, somewhere around there. And so we got the Medicare coverage then.
Hugely important.
And was very important. And then the rest of the insurance industry in this country picked right up on it and covered cardiac transplantation.
Was it still controversial in the public, though, at the time?
I don't think it was. It was somewhat controversial and somewhat limited, but the results were improving. More programs were starting. And there were rumors of this new immunosuppressive agent called cyclosporin that might help us get rid of the old conventional protocol, the prednisone azathioprine protocol.
At the time, was there some discussion already about the number of centers needed in the U.S. to, cover patients' needs?
That was explicitly addressed. And in fact, the representative of the transplant committee, or transplant community, was Terasaki of San Francisco, a distinguished renal transplanter. And he was addressing a congressional committee and called for regionalization and centers of expertise.
And you had linked to
we were sitting there. I mean,
Yeah.
all the Congress was interested in was the concept of transplant and Medicare coverage. And he got gavelled down by some senator and said, "Doctor, let's get something really straight. That is restraint of trade. That is against the Sherman Antitrust Act. This point will have no further discussion." End of statement.
So it was opposed.
Yeah, it was never even
Basically turned down.
right. And with the introduction of cyclosporin, then the number of institutions in this country just mushroomed based on that ruling.
Yes.
And it hasn't been until the last couple of years when
Indeed.
Medicare is turning around and now adding criteria to force these low-volume places out of business.
The other very important thing which was started under your presidency was the registry, which is still going strong. It's probably the best registry in the world of collecting medical data.
I would have to agree with you on that. I think that's one of the significant contributions of the society was the formation of the registry.
How did you come up with the idea?
I think it was a consensus thing there was a cardiologist at MCV named Hostello, who was named the first secretary, and she thought it'd be a good idea to keep track of all the transplants being done in the country. She's also my wife. And so we would sit down over the kitchen table with all this stuff coming in and start the registry, which was then picked up by Mike Kay because he had a bigger staff. And at that time, Mike was at Minnesota, I think.
And he was the first director of the registry.
Yes.
Yes.
And he took off and ran with it.
Mm-hmm. And this was appreciated by all the centers?
Yes. Yes, it was a voluntary registry with close to 100% participation.
Because that was very unique amongst medical societies at
Correct.
the time, to start their own registry on interventions.
See, our goals outlined explicitly in the first meeting, well, from an American viewpoint, was educate Medicare and get coverage, but then establish a registry, establish a journal, and establish a forum for scientific exchange. It's 4 simple goals.
And again, the Europeans started contributing data as well?
Immediately.
So everybody was embraced and get it going.
I think that was because everyone realized at that time, and even today, that cardiac transplantation was unique, required a challenging amount of work to pull off successfully. And the whole group as a whole were not in competition, but we're trying to work together to improve this. So don't forget that the discipline of cardiac transplantation was just emerging for what Jim Kirkland called yesterday the dark ages. And yes, we had a lot of bad publicity or bad reputation to overcome. I still have a copy of, someone gave it to me, of the Life magazine article that was shown yesterday with the cover of 6 recipients who died with the big subtitle saying, "Heart transplantation, is it worth it?"
Yeah, Cooley's series.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. But I mean, even more so, it was quite visionary to start your own journal, since there were other, journals already established for cardiology, for cardiac surgery. How did you come up with this idea?
I'd have to give that exclusive credit to Jacques Lochman. He wanted to be an editor of a journal and wanted this thing published, and by God, he did a beautiful job. But I remember him sitting there saying, "And we should have a journal." And I went, "What?" I said, "Are we too small for a journal?" And he just said, "I'll go to work on it. Is that okay?" And everyone said, "Fine, Jacques, go to it."
So that was it.
That was it.
And it has emerged to be one of the most successful journals in the whole medical field since then. So what's your impression today on the journal? How do you look at it today?
The journal almost becomes close to a Bible. I mean, it's got up-to-date clinical and basic science in heart-lung transplantation and mechanical assist. No other journal in our discipline exists like that. If you look at the numbers now involved, you can just look at the size of this meeting and picture the number of people in each program that are attempting to accomplish these tasks. And God knows, we all know it takes a phenomenal number of people to successfully pull off a program. It gives them an instantaneous point of reference for questions that may be asked.
So if you look back as our first president today, was this the society you envisioned at the time?
Actually, kind of, yes. Yes.
So you must be very pleased
I am
with
very proud.
what we did and what you did initially.
Yes.
And also the international flavor, does that still is a stimulus for you?
It's still a stimulus.
Is there anything from your point of view you think which could be improved?
I haven't put any thought into that one.
In terms of your old goals, when you
Well,
first started, is there
see,
still something missing
yeah.
which we haven't
The
achieved?
beauty of it is that the original goals have been accomplished. I think the beauty of this society is what I call the second generation thinkers. having mastered those goals, they can look back and they can say, gee whiz, we did this back then, let's do this. Now, the superb example of that is mechanical assist. Here is a concept that didn't exist in the 80s and early 90s and then became very infantile and was rapidly picked up by the society, right? It became an integral part of the society. So it's continued growth and development in the field.
Has this also changed your personal practice when it came up?
Oh, immensely.
So how did this sort of, when it first came up, how did you react as a cardiologist?
Oh, I have taken care of years and years and years of horrible heart failure at the bedside. One of my sarcastic responses to the trainees, the house staffs, and the fellows is that pills and potions can take you only so far. And we then have to develop technology to stabilize these patients or they're going to die. And I don't care what kind of pills and potions you have. You know, in the world of heart failure, which is my other world, we have made phenomenal progress. But when one starts that over the waterfall decline into deep class 3 and 4 heart failure, the standard dogma of internal medicine and medical therapy is no longer available for this patient. They have passed that point. We have done a phenomenal amount of work in expanding the time that the patients remain in functional class 1, 2, or early 3. And they have a better life. That's the name of our game. You know, a better quality of life, and they live longer with that better quality of life.
What's your thoughts on destination therapy, what we call today destination therapy?
I think it is a very viable option. We have a strong destination program in Virginia. We are intimately involved. We have a large syncardia program in Virginia now, the largest program in North America. We are very dedicated to it, and with the introduction of the new Freedom Driver, we're looking forward to destination therapy with this driver.
Let's move away from that topic. You have been always a prominent teacher in the field as well and mentor for generations of transplant physicians. What's your philosophy? What's your philosophical approach to mentorship?
Enthusiasm. I have a philosophy I developed a long time ago, and I named it contagious enthusiasm. If you're enthusiastic about your discipline and enjoy your work, it just gravitates to the younger people that are interested in the field. I've had the opportunity to train a good number of transplant cardiologists and work closely with transplant surgeons.
How do you react to the situation that obviously in a number of countries the interest of young surgeons, young cardiologists, young physicians in transplantation is sort of dwindling at the moment?
Well, I would say 5 years ago that was 8 years ago, was a dominant philosophy. And I would beat my head against the wall. In the last decade, the emergence of the solid data of the growing epidemic of heart failure is very real, Surgeons now saying the era of bypass surgery is gone. I mean, the stentors put them out of business. That the future of cardiac surgery is in heart failure surgery. The realization of cardiologists with a very vast growing number of patients with class 3 and 4 heart failure, that they have, the data that the cardiologists have generated in this field is very solid. They have an abysmal prognosis. And it's only through the combination of what I call medicine and surgery, science and technology, can we offer these people anything.
So you think the future looks rosy for young people who are interested in this field?
I can give you the perfect example. I'm putting together a fellowship for cardiology fellowship, 4th year of training in advanced heart failure and transplantation. There's now a separate board that is organized on this. And I was matching, board criteria to our fellowship program. And I had this young fellow on our service who, as part, like everyone else, was thinking about going into intervention. And I would just tease him about tripping over his colleagues, tripping him on the way to the cath lab at 2 a.m. because everyone else had the lab booked, and there's so many of them. He sent me an email, and it read something like, Dr. Hess, I enjoyed my rotation with you. I've read extensively about this epidemic you talk about and about your progress with mechanical pumps, and I'd like to be your fellow. Out of the clear blue sky.
That's very good. If we look into the future, how do you think heart transplantation will look like in 20 years from now? What's your prediction?
What I would love to see is the concept that we become a cell transplanter. Now, maybe this is my science background, my cardiology background, but if we can figure out the stem cell problem or the myoblast problem, or call it what you want, and make that viable, right, and rejuvenate native hearts with cell therapy from the patient perspective without having to undergo pumps and surgery and transplant, it becomes very real. That's the future. I mean, that's probably not in my career time. The realization that it's difficult to accept but must be accepted is in the United States, we are very donor organ limited. And this has supplied the tremendous impetus for mechanical support.
Do you think we'll get to that stage where the outcomes and the quality of life will be equivalent between heart transplantation and mechanical devices?
I've been thinking about that exact question recently, and I'm not too sure we'll see it in my career time, my lifetime. All of us who run big programs have patients doing well 20 years post-cardiac transplant, 20 plus years post-transplant. Not the majority of patients. The half-life is now, T1 half is at 12.5 years. All right, let's just take 12.5 years. You're asking a machine to work 24/7 for 12.5 years. That's tough. And, we just don't know now, right? We're like everything else. Mm-hmm. We were sitting around in Richard Lauer's porch where we'd meet every Tuesday night or every other Tuesday night. And someone would say, well, half our patients are going to do well at 12.5 years. Everyone would have said he would have been crazy. Mm-hmm. Because we were fighting the 1 year at a time battle in the early post-transplant period and the high mortality, and talking about 5 years. Now we're looking at patients that are 20 years out.
So you, as our first president, must be incredibly satisfied with the development since the foundation of our society, for particular in terms of patient outcomes.
Tremendous satisfaction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan.